In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the process of saving and reusing data from final gather points as well as photons. Alright, so here's the scene we're going to be starting with. So if I take this and just maximize this viewport and take just a quick render at what we have right now. Again, that's going to be Shift Q for this. And you can see right now that my render is taking quite a while, and that's because it's actually having to go through the process and calculate all of these final gather points. And right now I'm using strictly final gather in this scene, and that's what I'll use to actually illustrate the process of saving these maps out and being able to reuse these. Alright, so you can see it goes through the final gather point calculation, then smooths that out, and then gives me my final render. Now, this is good if I'm actually going to have something moving around in my scene. I would actually need to recalculate those final gather points because something is actually changing in the scene. But there are actually several instances where if you're doing something like a camera fly-through of your scene where actually nothing is moving, the only thing actually moving is the camera, there is really no need to recalculate all those final gather and all those photon points frame after frame after frame if nothing is actually physically moving in the scene. So let's take a look at how we can actually save this data out and start to save ourselves a lot of render time. If I go to the render setup and take a look down kind of just underneath these main final gather settings that we've looked at a few lessons previous, we also have the ability just below that if we can store a final gather map. Alright, so the first option is going to ask you to just read or write out a file. So what we can do is just make sure that we don't have anything in there. Now, whenever this checkbox is turned on, what's going to happen is MentalRay is going to take all the final gather point data that it calculates and actually save that out into this external file. So if we come in and either generate the final gather maps or render, either one is going to force this final gather data to be stored. So let's start by just generating the final gather maps. Alright, so it's going to go through, it's going to do the render, and this first frame, or this first instance, is actually going to take as long as it normally would because it is having to go through and calculate those and write those into this file. Alright, now once it's finished, it's going to go ahead and close out. It won't continue through the process if we just use this generate final gather map. It won't go ahead and do the final render. Now at this point, if I were to turn on this lock button, which is read-only, what's going to happen now is instead of recalculating those final gather points, with this lock turned on, it's going to read from this file. So now if I re-render, you'll see that my render happens much, much faster. Alright, it's because it's not having to go through and recalculate any of those final gather points. Now, there is a little bit of a trick to this, and that is, if you recall, in one of my very first lessons I had mentioned that these final gather points are based on what the camera can see. So we can actually see that if I go over to the Processing tab, and let me come down to the Diagnostics. That's what we're going to look for. Let's enable the Diagnostics, and let's enable the Diagnostics for the final gather points. And what this will actually let us do is see the final gather points themselves in our render. So let me re-render this, and you can see this is all the final gather point data that is being used by the renderer. Now where this gets to be a little bit of a problem is if I were to, let's say, move my scene at all and re-render, remember that it is using that stored final gather point data, so it's not recalculating, but you can see now how we start to get a little bit of a discrepancy here, because now we're looking at an area that was not visible to the camera whenever these final gather points were saved or stored. So this is where we start to run into a little bit of a problem. Everything is going to look good from that one angle, but as we start to get back here, we have no final gather points. And as we start to get back here to, let's say, the backside of this object and re-render, you can see now we really don't have anything back here, and this starts to become especially problematic because we can start to see a lot of these just kind of blotchy, kind of noisy areas. Alright, so how do we fix this? Well, if we go back to the render setup, and let's go back to this indirect illumination tab, if we leave this read-write turned on, but leave this lock turned off, what's going to happen is rather than rewriting all the final gather point data that's saved in this file, what will happen is it'll recalculate all the final gather points for this frame and then add them to what we already had saved before. So let's regenerate the final gather map. And again, this part's going to take a little bit longer because it is going to have to go in and recalculate these. So I'm actually just going to pause this for 1 second while we wait for this process to happen. All right, so there's that bit of the final gather map saved out. And again, that has just now taken all the point data that we have and then added it to what we already had before. So now, if I turn on my lock and re-render, it's now going to refer entirely back to that map that we had saved out. So everything looks good from this point. But again, as soon as we orbit, we should probably see a little bit of an area that was not visible to that particular camera as we saved out these final gather points. But if we do orbit back around, we should still see all the information that we had before, because it was originally in that file to begin with. Alright, so really the trick to this becomes, if you are going to be using some kind of a camera fly-through, and if you want to be able to store your final gather maps, you need to make sure that you have the final gather maps actually stored for all the areas that are going to be visible to this particular object. So let's regenerate from this particular camera viewpoint. And again, I'm just going to pause this. Alright, so that's been saved. Let's orbit back around and try to get this from a slightly different angle. And again, with this turned off, let's regenerate. Alright, so let's see what we have. Let's turn that lock back on. So now we're relying entirely on the saved final gather point data. Let's re-render that. This render should come back really quickly. Alright, so now we can start to see all this point data that we've amassed here. And we didn't quite get all these areas, but that's okay. You could always come back and try to be a little bit more careful with this. What I want to show now is why it does become so important that your objects do not move when you're actually saving any of this data out. So you can see right now everything looks good, everything aligns pretty well. But if this were any kind of a moving object, what would happen is that you would take this piece of geometry, move it over, and if we rendered it now, again, with this lock turned on, what we should see is the final gather point data stays originally where it was calculated. But now the object is over here. And it's kind of hard to see what exactly is going on here, but if I go back to the Processing tab, and let's turn this diagnostics back off, so that way we don't see these green points anymore. What you'll notice is now we have some of these shadows and some of these shading areas that were stored in the original final gather map, but now because this object is moved, that data does not fit over that object the way that it should. Alright, so that's why in the case of a moving object we have to recalculate the final gather points and the photon data every single frame. But, like I said, if we just have an object that is going to stay in one position, that maybe the camera is just going to move through and maybe fly past that object without it actually moving, we can very easily take some of this final gather data and the photon data, store it in a map, and that way it does not have to take the time to actually calculate that every frame when it really doesn't need to, and you can start to save yourself lots and lots of render time. So if I go back to this Indirect Illumination tab, just like what we were able to do with storing the final gather map here, if I come down and if I had global illumination enabled, or even caustic for that matter, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, we can come back down to the photon map, give it a map, let's say something like, particle or photon map. There we go. And generate the map for that. It would now store that in this particular file. And as long as this checkbox was turned on, it could just keep adding to that file. Alright. So that's a look at how we can start to save and reuse some of this indirect illumination data.